of our past and our future. Let me just read here for the recording. What I propose, since we are very few, and that is nice. Believe me, compared to other sessions where there can be many people, and I never get to know them. Maybe this will be an opportunity to interact nicely and hear your reflections. Is to offer a series of thoughts on where we are with our language, and then really opening up the whole thing to some discussion or reflections from your side or comments. At a time when it feels as if the country is two countries or several countries moving in parallel lines, or maybe in bifurcating lines, politics dividing us in dramatic ways, in conservative and liberals and Republicans and Democrats. It might be said that the one last aspect that ties us all together is the fact that we speak the same language. But the question really is, are we still using the same language, or are we using different types of English, different types of languages in order to exist in our individual silos, in our necks of the wood, rather than being fully part of the mainstream? If you tune in to different media, if you go to Fox News, or if you go to MSNBC, or if you read different types of printed media, you will notice that there are really different types of lexicons and vocabularies. People referring to sometimes the very same event, or same minorities, or same issues in very different terms. And we could describe that as lexical or verbal differences, but we could also say that at times when the vocabularies diverge, go in opposing directions, this is when countries are shaken to the core, and when finding bridges or strategies to keep everybody together, glued into the same idea, might become increasingly more difficult. It is the nature of language that young people tend to be more liberal when it comes to speaking it. It is with young people that we have all the time new words. And if you follow social media, or if you simply stay tuned to a conversation that young people, high schoolers or middle schoolers or college students might be having, you'll notice, at least people of a certain age, people of my age, in their 60s, that there's a wide variety of words that might be escaping us. And beyond that, also the syntactical patterns and the morphological patterns are different. And if they were listening to us, older people or people of a certain age, they would also express the fact that we talk different, we think different, because the nature of one's language is supposed to be also the pattern of one's thought. And thinking is shaped by the way that we organize our sentences and express ideas, emotions, and thoughts in either more formal or more loose sentences. And yet, all of us have this main language that we call English. One of the first questions that I would ask myself, I would ask all of us, is if the name that we use to refer to it is still the appropriate one. A couple of centuries after a couple of centuries plus after the colonial period, the English language that came with the initial settlers and pilgrims has mutated dramatically over time. And today in the world, it is America and not Britain that really shapes the pattern through which people use English. Many more people go through English language schools in the United States than in what used to be the British Empire. American movies, social media, the internet, much of it is shaped in the United States and not anymore in England. So is it time to change the name of the language? Should we begin calling it American and not American English? Or should we emphasize that it is American English, just as Canadian English or Australian English or Indian from India English are different from each other? This, after all, is an imperial colonial language that has traveled the world. And though we are at the epicenter of what is today the main fountain of creativity of the English language, it has many other varieties. English is not the most popular, meaning the most spoken, used language in the world. That is the varieties of Chinese, Mandarin, and Cantonese. But it is the most popular language when it comes to second language users. There are more second language users, that is, people that were not born into the English language, in the world, the native English language, at a ratio of 3 to 1. 3 being people that have learned the language elsewhere and use it as a second, third, or fourth language for education, for politics, for business, for entertainment, for all kinds of things, tourism. Whereas those of you, because I'm an immigrant from Mexico, those of you who are native English speakers in America in particular are becoming increasingly minority. This is important because there's a lot of pressure on the native speakers to safeguard, protect, perpetuate the English language. And yet, it is the non-native English speakers that use it in very free-spirited ways. And many of us, when traveling in Asia or in the Arab world or in Europe, stumble time and again with signs that are supposedly in English, but they don't mean much, or simply open a fortune cookie at the end of a meal in a Chinese restaurant and see what a false translation might all entail as an expression of something in one language that is immediately rendered into the other language, English, by someone that doesn't fully necessarily fully understand it. English is, if you think of it, the way we have remained Americans for all this time. If you imagine for a second what is required to create a new nation, if you were posed the task of creating a new country out of nothing, the ingredients that you would need are, well, a territory, a government, with it coming a central bank, a post office. You would need some kind of shared history or mythology in order for this place to coalesce as a country. You would need a flag, a national anthem, and you would need a language that brings everybody together. There are many nations in the world that don't have an official language. Think of Canada, think of India, think of Switzerland. Just to give you some examples, in India alone, there are dozens and dozens of languages. Canada has regions that are francophone and others that are anglophone. And in other parts of the world, like Switzerland or Belgium, the languages coexist and have sometimes equal power in government and in other spheres of life. The United States doesn't have an official language in our nation's constitution. And nowhere in the documents that the founding fathers created is it stated that we all have to be communicating in English and that English is to be forced on everybody. And yet there are many states in the country, the states themselves, that do make English official. And one of the questions that we might ask is, what is the difference between not having an official language in a country and having one in a state? What What does that mean in terms of expression, freedom of speech, compulsion to teach certain subjects in school in a particular way, and the obligation of newcomers to embrace this language as a way to be part of the full community? These are some of the questions that the very first lexicographer in this country, Noah Webster, posed himself at the very beginning of the 19th century. Noah Webster, who is sometimes referred to as the last and least known of the founding fathers, came up with the idea that in order for the United States to become fully and completely a country with its own idiosyncrasy, with its own rules and regulations in terms of government, with its own folklore, needed to embrace one single language. He wasn't proposing that it would be an official language, but he was proposing something, in my view, more nuanced and significant. He was proposing that we have an American dictionary of the English language, that we distinguish our dictionaries from the dictionaries that the British, the English in general, had created. In particular, he had this tension with a man he never met, a man who lived about 50 years before him, Dr. Samuel Johnson, who was a doctor without ever having a doctorate degree from a university and who was a polymath in the most extraordinary way. He was a novelist and an essayist and a columnist and a travel writer. And he was also the author of the first, and to my mind, the best dictionary ever produced of the English language. It's called A Dictionary of English. And it appeared the first attempt at it appeared in 1755. And over time, Johnson kept on developing. His purpose in the 18th century was to cleanse the English language of England from what he described as the pernicious French influences. Too many French words in his perspective. And so he sat down and he thought he would do it in a year and a half. It took him 17 to produce this dictionary. And the dictionary is extraordinary for many, many reasons. One of them is the fact that very few dictionaries are made by a single person. Mostly dictionaries are made by committees, and he's one of the first that produced a modern, full-fledged dictionary single-handedly, although he had a slave that he liberated and was his servant at home, and he was incredibly learned and helped him to produce this dictionary. All this to say that when Noah Webster began to think that we needed our own dictionary, different from the dictionaries that England had, he thought that he would Americanize the dictionary that Dr. Johnson had produced. And he started with a proposal in 1809. And again, it took him many more years than he imagined. I live in Amherst, Massachusetts. I teach at Amherst College, as Meg said, and it is in Amherst where Webster devised all these strategies, and between him here and New Haven, produced in 1828 the first dictionary, which full-fledged, which he called an American Dictionary of the English Language. There are many words in it that are very similar to the British words, but there are many others that are very different, very American. And mostly it is a matter of spelling. He descends from the way the British spell certain words, the word theater, for instance, instead of R-E, he puts the E-R, and other many different words that are spelled or pronounced differently in England than in the United States. And it was a great achievement. It was also a way to go immediately into bankruptcy. Dictionaries are can be popular, but they take a long time to produce. And they quickly, in order to remain current, they need to be updated. And at that time, without internet, without any social media, updating a dictionary meant a new edition, which would require new investors and a new printer and so on and so forth. So it was rather difficult. Webster did a bunch of efforts, and eventually, just as he was dying, he did something that is also crucial in the history of the American language. He sold the rights to his dictionary to a set of brothers, the Merriam brothers, that thought that it would be a good investment to expand on the work that Webster had done and continue this dictionary. And today we have at the very heart of our own country and our own culture the Merriam-Webster dictionary. It's a commercial enterprise. It depends on the sales of the books and of ads online in the online version of the dictionary, but it is the most authoritative, up to date, up to date form that allows us to know what is the language that we use and what isn't. Think of it this way, friends. What would we do? Who would we be if we didn't have a dictionary? Not only the Merriam-Webster dictionary, but any dictionary. If dictionaries disappeared all of a sudden magically, what would happen to our language? Could we survive? Well, I asked this question about 6 months ago in Los Angeles at a gathering of very bright high schoolers, many of them valedictorians, that had come to talk to me about dictionaries. I asked them the same question that I'm asking right now. Do we need a dictionary to have a culture? Do we need a dictionary to have a life? Do we need a dictionary to know what is and isn't accepted? These were very sharp kids, very, mature beyond their age, very bookish, very learned. You might be surprised, however, to hear that the vast majority of them, there were about between 12 and 15 in front of an audience of 150 people, who said without hesitation that we really don't need a dictionary, that dictionaries are a dinosaurs of another period, that they seldom go to a dictionary to look up a word. In their houses, there's no longer a dictionary, again, for the Victorian kids, because they can go online and check a word anytime. And they could see perfectly the perpetuation, the continuity of the English language without a dictionary. Well, just as I was mentioning the story of this wonderful dozen or so valedictorians, about 3 weeks ago, I had another conversation. I'd been really on the road talking about dictionaries because of the publication of The People's Tongue, the book that Meg was mentioning in the title of this talk, with the former president and publisher of Merriam-Webster, John Morse, who spent about 18 years editing the Merriam-Webster dictionary. And I discussed with him all kinds of strategies. And I started strategies that they take in order to retain the vitality of the dictionary and his own reaction to the young people's approach that a dictionary really is no longer needed. One of the first questions that I asked John was if he could explain how is it that about 2 years ago, the offices of Merriam-Webster, which are located in Springfield, Massachusetts, about 20 minutes from where I am, and have been there since the Merriam brothers acquired Webster's dictionary, recently had to close because a deranged man from Texas had written violent messages saying that he was going to come and kill every single staff member of Merriam-Webster because of their decision, the staff decision, to have a new definition for the word woman that would describe that noun in part as connected with trans. Particularly what he was so offended by was trans woman, a person who is born a man but chooses to become a woman. In his opinion, based on what the FBI found in the coded messages that were sent to the staff of Merriam-Webster, the fact that Merriam-Webster dictionary would include this definition of woman would make it accepted and that society would need to change as a result. And he was furious about this. Less violent, but equally loud, were the responses to Merriam-Webster deciding to change the definition of the word they, the noun they, to reflect not a plurality of individuals, but a plurality of genders within a single individual. Again, the attacks that came to the Merriam-Webster webpage more or less argued that the moment the dictionary accepts a new definition of a word, that word is accepted in the culture, and now we all have to live by it, to accept it. So think of it as maybe the word of God, and obviously being facetious here or playful. The dictionary doesn't see itself as a sacred text. It is not received from Mount Sinai. It doesn't purport to represent the word of a higher being. And yet the dictionary does offer us a glimpse of what should be and what is. There are two different types of dictionaries. The descriptive dictionaries, Merriam-Webster is a descriptive dictionary. That is a dictionary that describes the way people use the language. And there are prescriptive dictionaries. That is a dictionary that prescribes, that mandates how a language should be used. In the English-speaking world, in England, especially in the United States, we have descriptive dictionaries. Noah Webster thought that the dictionary should not request changes in the way people use the language, but should reflect the changes that the people have been using in the pages of the book. And when I talked to John Morse, he said that is exactly the duty to this day of the staff of the Merriam-Webster dictionary, to bring back to the American people the way we are using the language, as stated by quotes, by references, and by all kinds of paraphernalia that is needed to see how the word they has changed, or the word bad has changed, or the word gay has changed, or the word woman has changed, so on and so forth. The premise here is that though we all speak the same language, the words that we use are never static. And if it is a truism that nobody can bathe in the same river twice, not only because the river changes, but because we change when we go to the river, nobody uses the words in the same way as the previous generation. Words change over time. When I arrived as an immigrant to this country in 1985 from Mexico, the word bad, B-A-D, meant the opposite of good. Today, the word bad, used in hip hop, in rap, in social media, can be a way to emphasize good. That's really bad, meaning that's wonderful. Or the word ridiculous, used to refer to something that was not taken seriously. And now ridiculous can be an expression of astonishment. Oh, that's ridiculous. It's a great movie. Or the word insane. It used to refer to somebody who was not considered psychologically in the norm. Insane can now be an expression of extraordinary. Oh, I love that book. It was insane. So the words change. They change over time, and they change as a result of the use and abuse that all of us do when we engage them. In the end, the words don't belong to anybody. They don't belong to professors like me or pundits or editors in legacy media. The words belong to the people that use them. And if everybody's going to use the word bad in a different way than the generation before, then the word bad eventually will need a new definition in the dictionary. Conversely, in France, in Spain, in Portugal, dictionaries, at least the ones that are produced by the academy, and here I'm not talking about universities, but l'Académie Française or the Royal Academy of the Spanish language, those dictionaries tend to be prescriptive. If the word weekend has crept into the French language, the Académie Française will make a statement saying, that's an Anglicism, we don't accept it, we're going to have the way we describe that word, and you, French speakers, should not be using le weekend. In other words, the dictionary is a tool to corral and to persuade individuals on how to use the language. I think that if Merriam-Webster all of a sudden came out and said, well, don't use the word woman in that way, everybody would laugh at Merriam-Webster. Who are they to tell us how to use the language? And frankly, when a teacher says to the kids, I know how you're using that word, but do you know that the meaning is different? The teacher is already adapting to the descriptive quality of the language. The teacher cannot say, don't use this word in a particular way, but can recommend how to use the word in a better way. Think for a second of profanities and of slurs. For a long time, dictionaries, Johnson's dictionary and Webster's dictionary, did not include profanities, slurs. Um, and the argument was that even though they were descriptive dictionaries, they were also tools, educational tools, in that we shouldn't include the word fuck in the dictionary. And indeed, it wasn't until 1974 when that word was included in Merriam-Webster. And the result was an uproar. Really? You include all those words? What are we going to do now? We'll have to invent other or prescribe other words. So the history of dictionaries is also the history of prudish, puritanical approaches that often resist change, even though the staff is convinced from the very beginning that that change is essential and that language is constantly changing. There was a particularly scandalous moment in the history of Merriam-Webster in 1963 when what is called Webster Third, the third big edition of Merriam-Webster, was published. And for the very first time, definitions, instead of being based on quotations from Shakespeare and Milton and Whitman and Emily Dickinson and Emerson, the dictionary makers decided that they needed to expand their sources, and movies could now be quoted, musicals, songs. So you have Cole Porter, and you have Broadway shows, and you have movies that are referenced in the dictionary for words that at that time were mostly considered to be part of popular culture. And when the dictionary was published, and it was a mammoth of a tome, there were many purists who thought we have gone to the dogs. We have destroyed the language. If Merriam-Webster can now be looking, as he does today, at the movies of Quentin Tarantino and the movies of, you name it, any director as examples of how the language changes, then anything is valid. But yeah, the truth is that anything is valid. And rap and hip hop lyrics, corrido lyrics, pop songs are now sources that propel us to change what is or isn't in the dictionary. Let me say just a couple of other things and then we'll open it up. There's much more than we can talk about this, but time is limited and time is precious. One of the most important ones is that, as we all know, America is a land of immigrants, and immigrants bring with themselves languages from other parts of the world. Again, I myself, I'm an immigrant. I came with Spanish and I came with Yiddish to this country. It took me some time to learn the English language and be able to become a teacher and to communicate with you the way that I communicate with you now. But I haven't abandoned Spanish and I haven't abandoned Yiddish. And many immigrants don't fully abandon the languages that they came with. And even if they do, after the Italian immigration, there are many Italian words that have become integral to the English language in food, in crime, mafia, mafiosi, linguini, pizza, you name it. The same thing goes with the German language, with the Yiddish language, with the Russian language, with Scandinavian languages. Whatever immigrant group comes, it leaves an imprint on how the American English language is spoken. And the American English language keeps on expanding and expanding. Talk about Spanish. There are 60 million Latinos in the United States. Spanish is today the unofficial second language of this country, and there are many, many words of Spanish that have entered the English language. Lazo, rodeo, taco, tortilla, piñata, many, many. You don't have to be Latino to be able to be using all those words. So immigrants play a double role. On the one hand, they are quick learners of English. And in spite of what we hear from mostly conservative voices, that immigrants are destroying our country, that they don't learn the language, that they are taking space in our schools and beds in our hospitals. Truth is that immigrants are very motivated, very creative, very entrepreneurial, and they quickly learn the language. And they quickly also donate words from their language to American English. And that, in my view, has made American English much more cosmopolitan, much more open and global. If Noah Webster, who died in the middle of the 19th century, came back right now and was sitting here with us, there would be many words that he wouldn't understand. If Shakespeare came back, he died in 1616. If he came back right now and he donated about 2,000 new words into the English language. For instance, the word lawyer had never been used. Shakespeare introduced it to English. If he came back to us, there are many words that he wouldn't understand. The word gay, not to go even farther, for him meant somebody very happy and even loquacious. And we have given a very different meaning to that word. But that is as it should be. When we're no longer here, the language is going to continue to move. And our letters, correspondence, the books that we wrote will be seen as relics of the past because the language will have moved forward. So it is quite striking to me, and I'll conclude with this, that it used to be that when immigrants came to the United States, newcomers through Ellis Island, seeing for the very first time the Statue of Liberty, they would, one of the first things that they would see in English upon arriving, having gone through customs, is the sonnet that is engraved in the plaque of the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty that was written by Emma Lazarus, that everybody knows, the new Colossus. Give me your poor, your tired, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. That speaks to those immigrants, welcoming them to this country, and yet it welcomes them in English. When, upon arriving, the first Italians don't see that sonnet in Italian, or the Yiddish speakers don't see it in Yiddish, or the Russians and so on, they see it in English. And if they don't understand it, well, the task, the goal will be that eventually they will learn the English language, feel proud of it, and teach, not only understand that sonnet, the new Colossus, but teach it to their children and to their grandchildren. Would it be better, I asked my students, if we had the sonnet in every language that an immigrant has ever had, has ever come with in this country, so they can understand what those 14 lines in the sonnet are all about? Or do we continue to believe that it is the best approach to offer them a glimpse of a language they don't know as a way to inviting them to decode it in their road to assimilation, acculturation, however we're going to describe it? I leave that open to you. The last remark that I will make is that unlike many other European countries, particularly European, but not exclusively, English in England, and especially in the United States, doesn't have an equivalent of the Royal Academy of Spanish or the Académie Française in French or Accademia della Crusca in Italian. We don't have a federally funded institution to protect and safeguard the English language. The founding fathers had a big debate about this. Thomas Jefferson thought it was a terrible idea. He thought that the language should be left to the people, even if the people could destroy it. It would be better for the people to take care of it. John Adams, our second president, had a big argument with Jefferson and thought, among many other things they were arguing all the time, that this was a terrible idea, that we should have an academy because otherwise the English language would quickly deteriorate and no standards would be kept. He made a proposal to have an American Academy of the English Language that would receive funding from Congress and we would be devoted to protecting the English language. So can you imagine us having presidents that would allocate, in Congress, generations in Congress that would allocate money to an entity that would take care of learning and protecting and perpetuating the English language? There have been many subsequent endorsers of this idea, and yet, in my view, for better rather than worse, it has never taken shape. And so the language is left to us who know and don't know anything about it, the people, to do with it as we wish, when we wish, consciously or otherwise. And the fact that the English language is in American English in particular, is the most spoken language in the world in terms of second language speakers, and the fact that it's pretty alive and well means that it doesn't need any soldiers to be behind it, any government leaders to tell us that this is right or this is wrong. And yet, and I come back to the beginning of my talk, what is the authority in the language that allows us to know what is right and what is wrong? How does that authority perpetuate itself? who questions that authority, and will it last another generation or another 100 years? It used to be that a word, in order to be entered into a new edition of Merriam-Webster, it took generally between 10 and 15 years from the moment it was first registered. A word to be registered in Merriam-Webster has to be used exactly in the same way in 3 different locations that are disconnected from each other. But now, words enter the dictionary much faster. The word COVID-19 took literally 20 days in 2020 from the moment it was first registered to the moment it was incorporated with a definition to Merriam-Webster. This is how fast everybody was using it and how fast everybody was searching it. So it's fascinating how we use the language, who owns it, and how that English is pulling us apart, but also keeping us together. Thank you, Meg, thank you, friends, and maybe we can open it to reflections or questions or thoughts, anything that people want to say. We're not many.
Thanks, Ilan. That was so interesting. Does anybody have any questions or comments they'd like to share? Go for it, Tony.
So I was interested when you brought up the idea that words that once weren't acceptable now are, and how they change. I have a pet peeve, and it's about grammar and grammar changing. Just recently, there was an article by a language commentator in the New York Times saying that, why don't we end sentences with prepositions? And I get that, that's fine. But when I was a kid in school, we were taught that one doesn't graduate college, one graduates from college. And in the many, many years since I learned that until today, it's pretty much evolved into highly educated, even in print, people graduate college. And that's a very different meaning. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the change in grammar as much as the change in words.
Yes, grammar is changing very rapidly because of a variety of forces. Um, the great force behind the change of grammar is the oral language, how we use it on a daily basis. But what ultimately affects the use of grammar is the transition between the oral to the written. And that has to do with the different media that we use to communicate with one another. We have media, social media, that tends to reduce the space for and eliminate prepositions. In other words, not that it started necessarily that way in the oral language, but when you used to have a tweet that only had 174 characters, and people were abbreviating and using across all kinds of different ways and different ways of expression. Eventually, some of those, like LOL, ended up becoming words in the dictionary. They are registered now in Merriam-Webster. The British say I was in hospital, not in the hospital. I go to university, not to the university. And we have always put the they, or in both circumstances. We are not. We can defer from how they use it, but then slowly how the language changes over time. Eventually, a generation like yours or mine feels that dramatically when one realizes that people no longer graduate from college. And if they do, it's because they graduate college, not the from. But sometimes we can also add prepositions to other things that didn't have before. And it is kind of the modality. It's the way things change in the grammar. One of the best examples of that transformation, not about words, but about grammar, is simply going and reading a play like Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet. There are today modern English translations of Shakespeare into English. I'm not talking about translating into Spanish or the young generation needs a new translation in order to access Shakespeare because of the many ways that the language has changed, not only in terms of meanings of words, but in structures of sentences, how you start them, how you shape them. And Shakespeare died in 1616. We know that many of the plays of Shakespeare underwent in the first 20 years a lot of changes from the visible and invisible editors that brought the plays from the stage into the printed page. But we know specifically how much generations have struggled since then to keep up with the old way of building. And Shakespeare is considered modern English. Chaucer is considered Middle English, and then we can go back in time to early English. This, from Shakespeare to today, is 400 years. Cervantes, who died exactly the same year than Shakespeare, and who produced contemporaneously a masterpiece of the size and scope of Hamlet, Don Quixote. The Spanish language has not aged in those 400 years the way that the English language has. It's much easier to read Cervantes in the original, following the syntax, the morphology, than reading Shakespeare. Maybe because of the great vitality of the English language, the way English just goes places all the time and borrows and lends much more than the Spanish language. Maybe because no two individuals age the same way, and certainly no two cultures age in the same way. But whatever the answer is, there is a constant transformation, as you were saying, not only in the words, but in the way we shape them in a sentence. And my first two languages are Spanish and Yiddish. Yiddish was a language that came from German, but was written in Hebrew characters. As you know, German puts the verb at the very end of the sentence, whereas we put the verb the second or third word of a sentence. As Yiddish has evolved and has gotten transformed by Russian and by French and by English, the placement of the verb has moved into the middle of the sentence in Yiddish and even to the beginning of the sentence. It still has Germanic roots, but that doesn't mean that it has to behave exactly in the same way. And I think that the original structures of English are changed in terms of syntax because of how distant we go, how far we go from the original foundations of the language, and how added individuals keep on changing, in linguistic groups keep on changing the language in a variety of ways.
So are you saying that if English was confined to England, are you saying that it would change less?
Sure. Yeah.
But Spanish is all over the world also. I mean, Latin America and
but Spanish doesn't have the Spanish is all over Latin America. It's in parts of Africa, but right. Spanish is not the language of business transactions of the internet in the same way that English is, or French for that matter, etc. Other imperial languages.
Anybody else have a question or comment they wanted to share?
Well, then I have one more. I was once reading, I find the language fascinating. I read much about it. Not that I speak many, but I was reading this book. You might know Bill Bryson, Mother Tongue.
Sure.
So I read it a long time ago, and he made a comment that the most pure, close to colonial English in this country is actually at that time was in Appalachia.
Sure.
Because they were so isolated. And yet at that time, those East Coast elites that at least some of us are, would have listened to that language, that English, and found it uneducated and crude.
Perfect example.
So
another example of that, Tony, is that there is a region in New Mexico today where that has been fairly isolated. There was an article in the New York Times not long ago that speaks Spanish the way it was spoken at the time of the conquest. And those Spanish speakers that visit the place don't understand the locals, and the locals don't understand the visitors because of the isolation. And it's the kind of Robinson Crusoe effect. If you put a language speaker or two language speakers, because they would need to be interacting with one another in an island for a long period of time, not only are they reshaping the language, but they are ceasing to register the changes that the language is experiencing in the rest of the world. So if you brought them back after 30 years, they would not know many, many words that everybody is taken for granted all the time, or they would have a different meaning for those words. And their immediate reaction is likely to be anxiety and fear and a sense of dislocation, because languages need to be exposed to other languages, need to be palpitating by registering what is happening around them. And the languages that fossilize, Latin, for instance, in Latin, you might study it in the university, but there's no way to sing a rap song in Latin today. There is no way to refer to certain medication in Latin, or to refer to microchips, or to certain ingredients that you use in the kitchen all the time, because they have not entered the world of Latin. And you could invent them, but they would not be spontaneous words. And yet, others could say that by incorporating all these words from Italians and French into English, we're polluting the language. We're not keeping it, protecting it. But the fact is that the language is alive precisely because it keeps on borrowing from others and back and forth. So it's fascinating, that tension between continuity and constant transformation. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you to the library, and Meg, thank you very much for organizing this.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Ilan. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. Good night.
Bye-bye.